The following is a special lecture titled The Chinese Economic Miracle. The lecturer is Professor Philip Brown. Professor Brown is an assistant professor of economics at Colby College. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree from Colorado College and his doctorate in economics from the University of Michigan. In addition to his position at Colby College, Professor Brown serves as a research fellow at the University of Michigan's William Davidson Institute. He has published a number of academic articles and does frequent fieldwork in China and Latin America. In 2005, Professor Brown served as the principal investigator of a detailed study of China's new cooperative medical system. Professor Brown has also received numerous prestigious fellowships and won the John Elliott Parker Memorial Prize in Labor Economics and Human Resources.
Open up virtually any major newspaper and you're likely to find an article about the Chinese economy. Now, this might take the form of an article about America's trade deficit with China. Or maybe it's an article about how Chinese demand for oil is driving up prices for gasoline in the United States. But if you keep reading in those articles and you get a little bit further into it, you're likely to read a line that says something like, China has been growing at a remarkably fast rate for the last 30 years. It makes you stop and wonder, how is it that China is growing so fast? What are the fundamentals underlying this growth, and is it sustainable into the future? That's going to be the topic of our discussion today. Let me give you a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to begin with a review of economic reforms in China. I'm then going to discuss China's economic growth today and try to quantify that. We'll then identify policies that contributed to that growth. And finally, we'll discuss some challenges that China must meet in order to maintain its rapid economic growth. So, beginning in October 1949 with the founding of the People's Republic and continuing through the early part of this decade, China has been dominated by three very powerful leaders, the tenure of each of whom was characterized by a very different economic policy. Under Mao Zedong, for example, you had these catastrophic attempts at economic self-sufficiency, often with terrible consequences. Now, Mao set up communes in industry and also in agriculture. And during one 3-year period, known as the Great Leap Forward, 40 million people starved to death. Now, to put that in perspective, that's the population of California and Oregon combined. After Mao died in 1976, Deng Xiaoping led pragmatic and experimental reforms that gradually opened up the Chinese economy. Jiang Zemin then oversaw the spectacular trade and investment-driven growth that led to the growth of coastal China. So China's economic miracle really begins with Deng Xiaoping, and that's where our story today should also begin. Deng Xiaoping seized upon the four modernizations proposed by Zhou Enlai in 1975. Now, Zhou Enlai was a close comrade of Mao's, yet he never had an opportunity to see his ideas brought to fruition. These modernizations led to the most rapid development of a sizable emerging economy in history. The four modernizations program targeted agriculture and industry, science, and national defense. And at each step, it sought to undo Mao's destructive program of economic self-reliance. The structure of industry also underwent a profound transformation during this time. Prior to the modernization program, output was dominated by a monolithic state enterprise controlled by the state. Under reforms, however, enterprises established by local governments began to chip away at this state dominance, and later on, private firms, often in partnership with foreign collaborators, further eroded state control. At the same time, the profile of industry changed radically during this time. China shifted away from a heavy industry to the light manufacturing that we associate with Chinese production today. A rudimentary commercial banking structure was also set up during this time. In 1978, the central bank was separated from the Ministry of Finance, nominally separating monetary and fiscal policy. And 4 new banks were also established during this time. Each had its own portfolio for loans, one focused on agriculture, for example, and another focused on construction. Yet over time, the lines between these areas blurred, and these banks went on to compete with one another. Perhaps most famously, Deng Xiaoping set up special economic zones in China. The idea here was to use incentives to funnel foreign direct investment into manufacturing for export, and this would help to facilitate China's integration into global trade flows. Why did China want this? Well, there's three primary reasons. First, they can earn foreign exchange that could be used for investment. Second, they gained access to new technologies. And third, they gained valuable management experience. Okay? What did the foreigners get out of this? Well, China has a huge labor pool, and it's a relatively skilled labor pool. And moreover, China had a fixed exchange rate. So this seemed like a relatively low-risk place to do your manufacturing. Now, let me show you a photo here. This is Shenzhen. This is one of the southernmost cities in China. In fact, this photo is taken in the mid-1970s, standing in Hong Kong, looking across the border into China at this small fishing village of Shenzhen, which at the time consisted of a few hundred households. Now, this is the type of place that Deng Xiaoping had in mind for special economic zones. This is the place where he wanted to set it up. And indeed, in the late 1970s, he traveled to Shenzhen and he proposed this idea. This was going to be the place where economic reforms were going to be experimented with. Sure enough, economic reforms really took off. And this is what Shenzhen looks like today. Shenzhen is now a city of 12 million people, and indeed, it is China's wealthiest city. Under Jiang Zemin, the export model was set in stone. The manufacturing sector, spurred by external demand, would dominate growth. Moreover, this expansion was underpinned by the relocation of multinationals' assembly processes to China. Now, China's integration into the global economy was crowned in 2001 by its accession to the World Trade Organization. This gives preferential trading rights to China, but perhaps more importantly, it also forces China to open new sectors of the economy to competition. And later on, this would lead to economic growth. China's overall share of global trade increased from less than 1% in 1979 to about 6% by 2003. Imports and exports grew at 15% annually. This is more than double the rate of the rest of the world. Moreover, by 2003, the end of Jiang's leadership, China accounted for nearly a quarter of all global growth. This is a remarkable statistic. Now, of course, individuals started to benefit from this as well, and personal incomes were on the rise. And this, of course, led to Walmart coming into China and lots of other Western companies as well. Indeed, the first Walmart in China opened in Shenzhen, that small fishing village, in the mid-1990s. And as of today, there's about a dozen supercenters in Shenzhen alone. So this leads us to the question of the current leadership, under who and when, and some might also ask, how. Current President Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao will not veer from the economic principles established by their predecessors. In fact, they were chosen precisely because they will continue to pursue core macroeconomic policy. And they will continue to emphasize structural reform to ensure sustainable growth as well. They both have very strong technocratic backgrounds. These are the men that are capable of this type of leadership. Nevertheless, they face some serious social problems, some without obvious remedies. Now, it must be stated that despite these social problems, the economic growth performance so far has been absolutely stunning, and if anything, it has been stronger than their predecessors. So let's now switch and talk about China's modern economy, the robust economy that we see in China today. Now, for many economists, economic growth is synonymous with growth of GDP, or gross domestic product. After all, GDP is the total value of all goods and services within an economy, so this seems like a natural place to begin our investigation. In 2006 in China, GDP hit $2.7 trillion. This makes China the fourth largest economy in the world after surpassing France and the United Kingdom in 2005. In terms of the growth rate, this has meant that China has grown at about 9.5% each and every year since 1978. Now, this is absolutely staggering. My income doesn't grow at 9.5% a year, but if my bosses are watching, I hope it will. Now, to put this into perspective, the Chinese economy doubles every 7.5 years. Absolutely remarkable. Moreover, when you look at this in a per capita income basis, that is how much individuals are earning, by 2006, the number increased to $2,000 per year. Now this puts China squarely in the lower middle income category. But when you consider purchasing power parity measures of income, that is what the income actually buys, China's GDP per capita is $7,500. And indeed, in purchasing power parity terms, China's economy is the second largest in the world. Nevertheless, there are reasons to believe that China's economic growth is overstated. Now, I have a chart here that I'd like to share with you. This describes what's happening with economic growth in Taiwan in the late 1960s, in South Korea in the late 1970s, and in China in the late 1980s, as well as the late 1990s. In all four cases, you can see that the official change in GDP is quite remarkable. In Taiwan, for example, in the late 1960s, GDP increased by 50% over a 4-year period. And yet, I'm going to give you 3 reasons to suggest that perhaps the figures that we see for China in the late 1990s and in the early 2000s might in fact be overstated. First, let's consider energy consumption. Now, it's natural to believe that energy consumption might rise with rising GDP. And in fact, we see evidence of this in Taiwan, in Korea, and even in China in the late 1980s. For example, in China in the late 1980s, energy consumption increased by 20%, while GDP increased by 32%. And yet, in the late 1990s, energy consumption actually fell in China. Now, that's not to say that that couldn't happen, that you can't have energy consumption falling while you have economic growth, and yet it does seem a little bit strange. Another example is urban employment. Well, again, we might assume that urban employment increases with rapid economic growth, and indeed the evidence from Taiwan in the 60s, and Korea in the 1970s, and China in the 1980s all says that in fact urban employment does rise dramatically with economic growth. Not so with China in the late 1990s though. Urban employment was virtually flat. Okay, again, this doesn't rule out rapid economic growth, yet it seems a little bit inconsistent with the evidence. Finally, let's consider the 2000 growth rate in Beijing. In the first 6 months of 2003, Beijing grew at an annualized growth rate of 27%. That is remarkably fast. That says that the Beijing economy is going to double in size in a 3-year period. At the same time, Beijing was absolutely paralyzed by SARS. People were not going to school, businesses and manufacturers had shut down, and the government was operating on a skeleton crew. And yet, somehow they were able to grow at 27%? Seems questionable. And yet, at the same time, there's also reasons to believe that all these GDP figures are in fact understated. In 2005, China undertook its first detailed economic census ever. This was part of its obligations under the World Trade Organization. What they did is they sent 13 million statisticians to comb the countryside looking at secondary and tertiary industries, sort of mom and pop businesses and services that may have been overlooked at previous accounts of the economy. What did they find? Well, they revised the GDP statistics upward by 17% for 2005. And what's more, they revised the growth statistics upward for 11 of the previous 12 years. This makes us stop and ask, well, why is it that the government might purposefully overstate the growth rate? Well, I have one possible explanation. I don't know that this is necessarily true, but one possible explanation. It turns out that national statistics are compiled from local statistics, and local statistics bureaus are under the control of local bureaucrats, and local bureaucrats' salary is dependent on local economic performance. You can do that math. And why might GDP figures be understated? Well, in this case, it turns out that under the revised statistics, China would not qualify for poor country privileges when it joined the World Trade Organization. I'm sure that this is not something that Beijing would have missed. So regardless of whether we believe that the Chinese economy grew at 9.5% or something higher or something lower, the simple truth is that the Chinese economy has been growing rapidly, very rapidly, in fact, for a sustained amount of time. And so it's natural to ask what policies have facilitated this economic growth. And there's at least 5 policies that have been very strong. First, since 1978, policy has progressively given greater rein to market forces, starting in agriculture and extending gradually to industry and to services. Price controls were dismantled step by step, private enterprises were allowed to emerge, and the state-owned enterprises were forced to compete against non-state companies, domestic and foreign, and sometimes against one another. Second, you had very prudent macroeconomic management. Before the mid-1990s, China's rapid economic growth was associated with some notable boom-bust cycles. However, this seems to have been managed by the mid-1990s as government practitioners got better at managing the macroeconomy. In addition, the government has managed to avoid some fatal policy mistakes frequently seen in emerging economies, things like monitorizing budget deficits and maintaining an overvalued exchange rate. Third, China has had a very outward orientation, or what some commentators have called China's Great Leap Outward. The progressive reduction in tariffs and non-trade barriers was pivotal in driving China's trade and investment growth model. Most imports are no longer subject to any kind of tariff, and those that are have an average tariff of only 10%. Indeed, China is among the most open economies in the world. China has also joined the league of top FDI destinations. In 2005, for example, 44,000 foreign enterprises were granted approval for operation within China. Moreover, China is beginning to define private property rights, and this privatization has fostered an entrepreneurial spirit. For example, China has significant representation in the Fortune 500. Companies like Lenovo and Haier are becoming household names. Nevertheless, strengthening farmers' land rights and advancing privatization in the core industries remain 2 areas of unfinished business in this area. Finally, China has undertaken massive, enormous public works programs. We've all heard about the Three Gorges dams, but perhaps you haven't heard about a new project that's going to divert river water from the lush south part of China to the very arid north of China. Beijing has some of its top minds, top scientists working on this project already, and I think that they'll probably see some results within the next decade or 2. You might also consider the preparations for the 2008 Olympics in Beijing and the 2010 World Expo in Shanghai. These cities are literally being transformed by the massive growth and massive construction taking place 24 hours a day, nonstop in these cities. Given all of this, it's natural to ask then, when will China's economy overtake the US economy? Well, analysts at Goldman Sachs believe that Chinese GDP could surpass US GDP by 2041 if China plays its cards right. Some other commentators, like Oded Shanker, who wrote The Chinese Century, says it may be as soon as 2025. Personally, I think that these 2 views are somewhat optimistic in light of some of the challenges that lay ahead. Specifically, overdue reforms in the banking sector, overinvestment, sluggish consumer demand, obligations assumed when China joined the World Trade Organization, slow technological innovation, environmental challenges, demographic challenges, state-owned enterprises, and social challenges. Now, I'd like to talk about a few of these areas today, especially those that get less attention in the press. Let's begin with slow technological innovation. Because China's businesses are at the mercy of political favor and because private entrepreneurs are starved of capital, long-term research and development has been discouraged. Instead, unsustainable price wars have been used to grab market share. Nor has China benefited as much as it might have from technology transfers or spillovers, despite the scant legal protection offered to intellectual property. There are some notable exceptions, however. For example, Otis Elevator ended up leaving the market, but not before it gave away all of its secrets to its Chinese partner. On the other hand, China has a late mover advantage. It has the ability to get things right where others have gotten them wrong. Moreover, it's hard to discount the fact that China is now exporting more IT than the United States is. In terms of sluggish demand, the Chinese are indeed spending more than they used to, and that's the good news. For example, there are now 59 washing machines per 100 households, up from only 1 in 1985. The number of Chinese traveling abroad has also similarly soared. It rose to 29 million last year, up 43%. But Chinese saving is growing even more rapidly. Indeed, even though China is investing at the staggering rate of 50% of GDP, it is still running a net savings surplus, and that surplus is growing. The government has adopted various policies to stimulate household consumption, but this has achieved only modest success to date. So why is this happening? Well, Chinese households have not changed their consumption patterns fast enough to keep up with the rise in income. In particular, this is attributable to concerns about unemployment, about high school fees, about high healthcare costs, and about the lack of pensions. Moreover, the one-child policy has made it harder for people to rely on their children as a source of support in old age, further encouraging savings. Furthermore, both private and state-owned firms are increasingly flush with cash, so their savings has risen sharply. Corporate profits have soared thanks to rapid growth, low interest rates, rising productivity, and cuts in employee benefits, and China's firms are now bigger savers than their households. Let's discuss some of the environmental challenges. China's resource consumption is staggering. It's a huge country, and perhaps it should be. But today, China is responsible for 30% of the world's annual coal consumption, 25% of the world's annual consumption of steel, 20% of the world's annual consumption of fertilizer. Moreover, China is now the second largest consumer of oil in the world. Now, the levels of this consumption are not so alarming because, after all, China is a very big country with an enormous population. And yet, we are alarmed by this. Why is that? It's because China is such an inefficient user of these resources. In industrial production, for example, China is only about half to three-fourths as efficient as Western producers of the same goods. This is particularly worrisome when you realize that China produces so many resource-intensive goods, from steel to television. Poor air quality, poor water quality, soil erosion, habitat destruction, and biodiversity losses are also very serious problems in China. Let me give you a few examples about this related to poor air quality. 5 of the 10 most polluted cities in the world are in China. In a quarter of Chinese cities, they experience acid rain 50% of the time that it rains. Indeed, China is the world's second largest producer of carbon dioxide and its largest producer of CFCs. I remember being in Lanzhou City a few years ago in wintertime, and it began to snow. And I remarked to my Chinese colleague, "Isn't it beautiful? The snow looks really beautiful." And my colleague remarked, "That's not snow. It was in fact pollution coming down." There are also some serious direct costs that result from all of these environmental challenges. For example, China has already lost $42 billion due to the creeping desert into desertification, and it's spent $54 billion in healthcare costs associated with pollution. Dust storms are now annual in China. They used to happen once every 30 or 35 years. Now they're absolutely every year in Beijing, and in really bad years, the dust blows all the way to Los Angeles. There are a number of demographic challenges as well. Demography has played a big role in the growth statistics as the share of workers in the population has risen. Indeed, GDP per capita has risen much more quickly than GDP per worker. This trend is soon going to end, however, as the one-child policy begins to affect China's workforce. By 2012, more people are going to be leaving the labor force than are going to be entering it. And as a result, China is going to become one of the most rapidly aging populations in the world. And this is going to trim GDP growth by as much as 1 percentage point per year. Welfare commitments are already huge, and they're only going to keep growing. The pension system is currently a pay-as-you-go system with current contributions financing current payments. And the transition to a fully funded individual account system could absorb more than 70% of GDP over the next 75 years. In other words, this is a truly enormous problem. Now, let's look at some population pyramids so that you can get a sense of how this works and appreciate this. On the x-axis here, that is the horizontal axis, you have population in millions of of men on the left-hand side and of women on the right-hand side. And on the y-axis, going up the middle, you have age groups. So for example, in 2000, between the ages of 0 and 4, you had about 50 million boys and about 47 million girls. Okay? And in 2000, the population projection looks quite robust, quite healthy. You have a very sizable portion of the population in the labor force to pay for the pension of retirees. By 2025, however, it looks a little bit different. You have far more people who are on the verge of retirement, and you also have more retirees than you had before in 2000. Now, U.S. Census Bureau projections out to 2050 look very different altogether. By 2050, it seems that we will have more people in retirement in China than are actually in the working force itself. And this is, of course, going to be an enormous problem, an enormous challenge. In terms of state-owned enterprises, deeply unprofitable state-owned enterprises were kept alive on credit lines through the 1980s and 1990s. The banking sector and the enterprises were both owned by the state. Loans to state-owned enterprises did not depend on profitability or on future benefit. In other words, they removed the cost part of any kind of cost-benefit analysis. As a result, today, the state-owned enterprises are often inefficient and financially insolvent. Now, that's not to say that they aren't profitable. Indeed, many state-owned enterprises in the core industries of steel and energy and telecom are extremely profitable. Yet their profits often come because of their monopoly status and because of government protection. And these profits, moreover, are cost to downstream industries and obstacles to further advancement in economic productivity. Today, about a third of industry is still owned by the state. Which brings us to our last area of discussion, social challenges. Unemployment is a huge and growing problem in China. Between 1995 and 2002, state-owned enterprise employment was cut by 48% to just under 40 million people. Given that the state-owned enterprise problem persists, the prospects of additional layoffs is unresolved. Moreover, there are about 100 million rural workers, surplus laborers from the rural areas, farmers who don't have enough work in the countryside, who have migrated to urban centers looking for work. People like these people shown in this photograph from Lanzhou City. These people are bottle collectors making a meager living by recycling plastic. China faces real challenges with poverty. There are about 150 million Chinese people who fall below international poverty lines. According to the World Bank, 106 million of them live on less than $1 per day. 80% of rural incomes lack basic health insurance, and 38% of them do not see a doctor when they fall ill because they can't afford to. Now, related to poverty, inequality is a huge and growing problem in China. Now, this is quite an interesting figure that I'm showing you here. The darker red areas are where incomes are higher, and darker blue areas reflect areas where income is in fact lower. And as you can see from this figure, all of China's wealth is concentrated along its coast. Now, economic theory suggests that as countries become wealthier, inequality first rises and then falls. But for Chinese peasants, the question becomes, how long do we have to wait? The richest 10% have 18 times the income of the poorest 10%. And while the poorest struggle to put rice on the table, the richest are spending $200,000 on Bentleys in Beijing. The distribution of income in China is now staggering. The income inequality is higher than Canada, it's higher than the United Kingdom, it's higher than that in the United States. This is perhaps surprising to a lot of people who think of China as being a communist country. Now, the government is caught in something of a bind. It needs the export sector to continue booming in order to absorb surplus labor from the countryside and the state-owned enterprises. But it's also aware that the rapid growth in recent years has opened fractures that could grow worse. You have to remember that every time you see a new factory, every time you see a new dam, every time you see a new highway, in a country of 1.3 billion people, someone was displaced to build that. And compensations have been meager. Moreover, corruption is emerging as a rural problem, and people are starting to take this to heart. Protests are on the increase. In 1995, there were about 10,000 local protests. By 2005, that figure had risen to 87,000 protests, almost 250 per day, involving more than 3 million people. So let me offer some concluding thoughts then. Clearly, China's economic progress can be characterized as rapid and sustained. It's hard to stand on the Bund in Shanghai and look across the river into Pudong and not see this remarkable, phenomenal growth that has shaped China. It is hard not to find that awe-inspiring. And yet at the same time, China's economic progress has been uneven and unequal. You don't have to travel very far outside of Shanghai to find real poverty these days. There have been claims made that China will grow at 7% or 8% or 9%, even 10, 11, or 12% per year. And yet we have to ask, have these experts considered all of the challenges that lay ahead? Have they thought about the environment? Have they thought about the state-owned enterprise problem? Have they thought about problems with demography, social problems, with consumption? Thank you very much.